The 613 Commandments, Part 6. The purpose of this Bible study is to examine a sample of Torah commandments to see how they would apply to Christians today. We've been using the list of 613 commandments developed by Maimonides and other rabbis as we study the original context of these laws in ancient Israel and consider their connection to the New Testament. We have also been correcting certain Jewish misinterpretations along the way. In this video, we will cover Leviticus chapters 11 through 15. You can also find the 613 Commandments summary PDF file at the Didactic Ministries website. Our first commandment, number 152, clean animals are edible, those animals that split the hoof and chew the cud. Leviticus chapter 11, verse 1. The Lord spoke again to Moses and to Aaron, saying to them, Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, These are the creatures which you may eat from all the animals that are on the earth. Whatever divides the hoof, thus making split hoofs, and chews the cud, among the animals, that you may eat. The commandments related to clean and unclean animals apply to everyone. We see in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 17, that the Apostle Paul taught the Jewish and Gentile Christians in Corinth to keep the laws related to clean and unclean things. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 17, Paul wrote, Therefore, come out from their midst and be separate, says the Lord, and do not touch what is unclean, and I will welcome you. Some Christian commentators may say that Paul was referring to spiritual uncleanness in this passage. However, notice specifically what Paul said, do not touch what is unclean. Here, the Apostle Paul is talking about physical things that render a person unclean. And in the whole Bible, there is only one place that you can go to define what is clean and what is unclean, and that is in the Torah. So clearly, Paul was teaching Jewish and Gentile Christians to avoid touching things that are unclean. Of necessity, this would have ruled out the eating of unclean animals. So we know that this law applies to all believers everywhere all the time. There are many animals that people are familiar with that divide the hoof and chew the cud, such as the cow, the buffalo, the sheep, the goat, and the deer or elk. Other animals would include the gazelle or the mountain goat and even the giraffe. Moving on now to Commandment 153, unclean animals are inedible, those that lack a split hoof or chew the cud. Leviticus chapter 11, verse 4, Nevertheless, you are not to eat of these, among those which chew the cud, or among those which divide the hoof. The camel, for though it chews the cud, it does not divide the hoof. It is unclean to you. Likewise, the shaphan, or hyrax, the rabbit, and the pig, you shall not eat of their flesh, nor touch their carcasses. They are unclean to you. As we saw earlier in Commandment 152, this commandment applies to all believers everywhere all the time, as is indicated in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 17. Most people in North America know what a rabbit or a pig looks like, but not many have ever encountered a rock hyrax. A rock hyrax is a small, furry animal about the size and shape of a North American groundhog. They're native to Israel and dwell in rocky places. If you travel to Israel and visit the oasis at Ein Gedi, you will often see these animals sitting on the rocks near the caves and the streams looking for water or food. Commandment 154, clean fish are edible. Leviticus chapter 11, verse 9 says, These you may eat, whatever is in the water, all that have fins and scales. Those in the water, in the seas or in the rivers, you may eat. This commandment also applies to all believers everywhere all the time, It is a universal moral command that God gave to his people. We know from nature that many of these animals that have fins and scales are healthy to eat, such as salmon, cod, and tuna. Once again displaying the wisdom of our Creator God in giving us rules for what we can and cannot eat. People who obey God's Torah commandments tend to live longer and healthier lives as a result. Commandment 155, unclean fish are inedible. Leviticus chapter 11 verse 10 says, "But whatever is in the seas and in the rivers that does not have fins and scales among all the teeming life of the water, and among all the living creatures that are in the water, they are detestable things to you, and they shall be abhorrent to you. You may not eat of their flesh, and their carcasses you shall detest. Whatever in the water does not have fins and scales is abhorrent to you." Again, this commandment applies to all believers everywhere all the time, as we saw earlier in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 17. God outlawed the eating of unclean sea creatures such as clams, oysters, lobster, and shrimp. These creatures are bottom feeders that tend to accumulate toxins in their bodies and thus give sickness to people who eat them. Once again, we see the wisdom of our great Creator God, who tells us what we can and cannot eat. People who obey God's Torah commandments tend to live longer, healthier, and happier lives as a result. Commandment 156, unclean birds are inedible. Leviticus chapter 11 verse 13, "These, moreover, you shall detest among the birds. They are abhorrent, not to be eaten. The eagle and the vulture and the buzzard, and the kite and the falcon in its kind, every raven in its kind, and the ostrich and the owl and the seagull and the hawk in its kind, and the little owl and the cormorant and the great owl, and the white owl and the pelican and the carrion vulture, and the stork, the heron in its kinds, and the hoopoe and the bat." This commandment again applies to all believers everywhere all the time. It is interesting to note that this commandment was mentioned in the New Testament. In Revelation chapter 18 verse 2, the Apostle John saw a vision about Babylon, and he recorded the fact that Babylon had become the cage of every unclean and hateful bird, showing once again that God's Torah commandments about clean and unclean animals had not been abolished, but was in fact still in effect. Most people know what a vulture, eagle, buzzard, or stork or heron look like, but not many people have probably encountered a Eurasian hoopoe, which is the national bird of Israel. It is a small bird about the size of a blue jay, and like a blue jay, it has a crest of feathers on the top of its head. It sits on the ground and feeds like a flicker, using its long, narrow beak to catch insects on the ground. When a male hoopoe wants to get a date with an attractive female, he's able to spread the feathers out on the top of his head like a fan and moves his head back and forth in order to get her attention. Commandment number 157, clean insects are edible. Leviticus chapter 11 verse 21, "Yet these you may eat among all the winged insects which walk on all fours, those which have above their feet jointed legs with which to jump on the earth. These of them you may eat, the locust in its kinds, and the devastating locust in its kinds, and the cricket in its kinds, and the grasshopper in its kinds." So here we see, once again, that among the insects, most insects are unclean, but those that have jointed legs for jumping are clean and can be eaten. It's interesting to note in Mark chapter 1 verse 6 that John the Baptist lived in the wilderness, where he wore a garment of camel's hair, and his diet consisted of locusts and wild honey. The desert locust looks very similar to a North American grasshopper, but is quite a bit larger. In large numbers, they could provide a lot of food for someone living in the desert. Some Israeli companies have begun exporting locusts as a food source. Commandment 158, unclean insects are inedible. Leviticus chapter 11, verse 23 says, all other winged insects, which are four-footed, are detestable for you. In other words, those that lack the legs for jumping are unclean. This commandment also applies to all believers everywhere all the time, and it would rule out the eating of such creatures as ants, spiders, centipedes, millipedes, and flies. People in North America will sometimes confuse the cicada with the locust. You might hear them refer to a 17-year locust plague. But in fact, this insect is actually a cicada and is more closely related to a fly and is therefore unclean. It has no jointed legs for jumping. Commandment 159, defilement by touching a carcass. Leviticus chapter 11, verse 24 says, by these, moreover, you will be made unclean. Whoever touches their carcasses becomes unclean until evening. And whoever picks up any of their carcasses shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. Concerning all the animals which divide the hoof, but do not make a split hoof, or which do not chew the cud, they are unclean to you. Whoever touches them becomes unclean. Also, whatever walks on its paws, among all the creatures that walk on all fours, are unclean to you. Whoever touches their carcasses becomes unclean until evening. This commandment also applies to all believers everywhere all the time. Ancient peoples did not know about bacteria and viruses, and we understand today that the rotting carcasses of dead animals would have been filled with all kinds of deadly microbes. So we know today that good hygiene limited exposure to potentially infectious diseases. So here we see again the wisdom of our great Creator God in giving Torah commandments to the children of Israel that would have promoted good health and long life. People who obey God's laws tend to live longer and happier lives as a result. Commandment 160, purification from touching a carcass. Leviticus chapter 11, verse 28 says, and the one who picks up their carcasses shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. They are unclean to you. This law also applies to all believers everywhere all the time. By washing their clothes on a regular basis, the Israelites were practicing good hygiene that limited exposure to potentially infectious diseases. Commandment 161, swarming creatures are unclean. Leviticus chapter 11, verse 29 says, now these are to you the unclean among the swarming things which swarm on the earth, the mole and the mouse, and the great lizard in its kinds, and the gecko, and the crocodile, and the lizard, and the sand reptile, and the chameleon. This law also applies to all believers everywhere all the time, and again shows the wisdom of the great Creator God in removing from the Israelites things that would have harmed them. We know, for example, that the mouse carries the hantavirus, which has afflicted so many people in the American Southwest. Commandment number 162, defilement by carcasses of swarming creatures. Leviticus 11, verse 31 says, these are to you the unclean among all the swarming things. Whoever touches them when they are dead becomes unclean until evening. Here again we see that God is giving to the Israelites Torah commandments that promote good hygiene, which limited exposure to potentially infectious diseases. Commandment 163, defilement by a clean animal that dies. Leviticus chapter 11, verse 39 says, also, if one of the animals dies, which you have for food, the one who touches its carcass becomes unclean until evening. He too, who eats some of its carcass, shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening, and the one who picks up its carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. This law also applies to all believers everywhere all the time, and promoted good hygiene, which limited exposure to potentially infectious diseases. Commandment 164, avoid defilement by swarming creatures. Leviticus 11 verse 43 says, "Do not render yourselves detestable through any of the swarming things that swarm, and you shall not make yourselves unclean with them, so that you become unclean." This principle applies to all people everywhere and is reinforced by what Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 17, where he clearly commanded Jewish and Gentile believers not to touch what is unclean. Commandment 165, consecrate yourselves and maintain holiness. Leviticus chapter 11 verse 44, "For I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. And you shall not make yourselves unclean with any of the swarming things that swarm on the earth." This commandment applies to all believers everywhere all the time. The Torah tells us how to live a sanctified life, that is, a life of holiness separated to God. God detests unclean animals and the touching of the carcasses of dead animals. These things render a believer unclean and detestable in the sight of God, so we should separate ourselves from these things that are unclean. As we see in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 17, the believer who is careful to maintain sanctification and holiness will be pleasing in God's sight, and he will welcome us into fellowship with him. Commandment 166, uncleanness after childbirth. In Leviticus chapter 12, verse 2, Moses wrote, "Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, When a woman gives birth and bears a male child, then she shall be unclean for 7 days, as in the days of her menstruation she shall be unclean. On the 8th day the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Then she shall remain in the blood of her purification for 33 days. She shall not touch any consecrated thing, nor enter the sanctuary until the days of her purification are completed. But if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean for 2 weeks, as in her menstruation, and she shall remain in the blood of her purification for 66 days. This particular commandment contains several different instructions, but the key here is the commandments that regulate marital relations after childbirth. A woman is to forego sexual relations with her husband for 7 days if she has a male child, or 2 weeks for a female child. The difference in the two lengths of time are both multiples of 7, which is one of the numbers that God uses in Scripture to denote a period of completion or perfection. These particular regulations also determined when a woman could enter the sanctuary in order to begin worshiping God again, and so these temple regulations are in abeyance. Commandment 167, Purification offering after childbirth. Leviticus chapter 12 verse 6 says, "When the days of her purification are completed, for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the doorway of the tent of meeting a 1-year-old lamb for a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering." This particular commandment applies only to the children of Israel, and since it involves temple sacrifice, it is currently in abeyance. The burnt offering and the sin offering are commandments that God gave to the children of Israel as tools to teach unbelievers about personal sin and the need for atonement. Galatians chapter 5 verse 3 indicates that every man who receives circumcision is under obligation to keep the whole law. So this particular commandment applies specifically to the children of Israel. Gentiles who lived among the Israelites were not required to offer sacrifices. Galatians chapter 3 verse 24 underscores the point that the law was a tutor designed to lead unbelievers to Christ so that we may learn about justification through faith. Romans chapter 3 verse 28 teaches us that Jewish and Gentile Christians alike are both justified by faith apart from the works of the law. Commandment 168, priests shall judge cases of skin disease. In Leviticus chapter 13, verse 1, we read, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, When a man has on the skin of his body a swelling or a scab or a bright spot, and it becomes an infection of leprosy on the skin of his body, then he shall be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of his sons the priests. The priest shall look at the mark on the skin of the body, and if the hair in the infection has turned white, and the infection appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is an infection of leprosy. When the priest has looked at him, he shall pronounce him unclean." This command applies to the priests who are the sons of Aaron. It is part of the religious law that regulated who could enter the sanctuary or not. Because the sanctuary does not exist today, this particular commandment is in abeyance. However, as we see in Ezekiel chapter 44, verse 23, it is the role of the priests to teach the people the difference between what is holy and profane, between what is unclean and what is clean. Today, many people equate the term leprosy with Hansen's disease. However, in ancient Israel, the Hebrew term for leprosy covered a wide variety of skin diseases. Some of those diseases were incurable, but other diseases were not. Commandment 169, priests shall isolate cases of skin disease. Leviticus chapter 13, verse 32 says, "On the seventh day the priest shall look at the infection, and if the scale has not spread, and no yellowish hair has grown in it, and the appearance of the scale is no deeper than the skin, then he shall shave himself, but he shall not shave the scale, and the priest shall isolate the person with the scale 7 more days. Then on the seventh day the priest shall look at the scale, and if the scale has not spread in the skin, and it appears to be no deeper than the skin, the priest shall pronounce him clean, and he shall wash his clothes and be clean." This is further instruction on how the Israelites were to deal with cases of skin disease. This particular commandment applies to the priests who are the sons of Aaron, because it was the role of the priests to teach the people the difference between what is holy and profane, between that which is clean and unclean, as we saw in Ezekiel chapter 44, verse 23. Here, God gave the Israelites instructions about quarantining people who had skin diseases in order to determine whether the person would recover or whether it was an incurable skin disease. Today we know that quarantine will limit exposure to potentially infectious diseases. Here we see again the wisdom of the great Creator God in giving to Israel Torah commandments that would have promoted good health and long life by isolating potentially contagious diseases from the community. Commandment 170, quarantine lepers from the general public. Leviticus 13, verse 45 says, "As for the leper who has the infection, his clothes shall be torn, and the hair of his head shall be uncovered, and he shall cover his mustache and cry, 'Unclean! Unclean!' He shall remain unclean all the days during which he has the infection. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp." This commandment applied to Israelites and resident aliens alike. It is a universal command that applies to everyone. Here we see God instructing the people of Israel in the principle of quarantining those who have potentially infectious diseases. Today we know that quarantine will help reduce the risk to the general population from potentially contagious diseases. Commandment 171, priests shall judge cases of rot in garments. Leviticus chapter 13, verse 47 says, "When a garment has a mark of leprosy in it, whether it is a wool garment or a linen garment, whether in the warp or woof of linen or of wool, whether in leather or in any article made of leather, If the mark is greenish or reddish in the garment, or in the leather, or in the warp, or in the woof, or in any article of leather, it is a leprous mark and shall be shown to the priest. This commandment applies specifically to the priests who are the sons of Aaron, and is part of the religious law that regulated who could enter the sanctuary or not. Since the sanctuary does not exist today, this particular commandment is in abeyance. This particular commandment deals with some kind of mold or mildew that has infected a garment. However, it continues to underscore the principle that good hygiene among the people would have limited exposure to potentially infectious diseases. Commandment 172, Regulations for Ritual Cleansing of a Leper. Leviticus chapter 14 verse 1 says, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, This shall be the law of the leper in the day of his cleansing. Now he shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall go out to the outside of the camp. Thus the priest shall look, and if the infection of leprosy has been healed in the leper." So here in this particular chapter, we see regulations that apply to the priests who are the sons of Aaron. They were the ones who were to adjudicate whether a person was clean or unclean. This is part of a larger body of religious law that regulated who could enter the temple or the sanctuary. Since the temple no longer exists today, this particular command is in abeyance. If the person was healed of the disease, the priest would perform a highly symbolic ceremony to indicate that the leper was now clean and able to rejoin society and come back into the camp. We see mention of this commandment in the New Testament. For example, in Luke chapter 5, verses 12 through 14, Jesus healed a leper and then told him to go and present himself to the priest for inspection so that he could be declared to be clean. Again, in Luke chapter 17, verses 11 through 19, Jesus healed a group of 10 lepers and then also told them to go and show themselves to the priest for inspection so that they could be declared clean and be brought back into the believing community. Commandment 173, Former lepers must shave and bathe. Leviticus chapter 14 verse 8 says, "The one to be cleansed shall then wash his clothes and shave off all his hair and bathe in water and be clean. Now afterward he may enter the camp, but he shall stay outside his tent for 7 days." Commandment 174, Former lepers must shave and bathe again. Leviticus 14, verse 9 says, "It shall be on the 7th day that he shall shave off all his hair. He shall shave his head and his beard and his eyebrows, even all his hair. Then he shall wash his clothes and bathe his body in water and be clean." This particular commandment applied to Israelites and resident aliens alike. It was a universal command for everyone. Once again, we see the principle of good hygiene that limited the community's exposure to potentially infectious diseases. In these two commandments, we see that the person who recovered from a skin disease was to wash his clothing, which would have removed germs and dirt and filth, and they were to shave, which would have facilitated an inspection by the priests to make sure that the leprosy or skin disease had not simply reappeared somewhere else on his body. Clearly, God does not consider shaving to be a sin. He required that the person who recovered from leprosy shave off all the hair of his body twice, once at the beginning and once at the end of a 7-day waiting period. In Scripture, God uses the number 7 to symbolize completion or perfection, so the 7-day waiting period symbolized the fact that the man was now fully and completely healed and cleansed. It also served to reassure the community that the man was truly healed. This 7-day waiting period was common when a person had any kind of a discharge, sore, or other kind of disease or infection. For example, in Leviticus chapter 15, verse 13, when a man was cleansed from a discharge that had continued for many days, he was to count 7 days for his ceremonial cleansing, and then wash his clothes and bathe in fresh water. So over and over again, we see this principle of waiting for 7 days and washing one's clothes and bathing in water, which would have promoted good hygiene, health, and long life within the Israelite community. Commandment 175, Purification Offering for a Former Leper. Leviticus chapter 14, verse 10 says, "Now on the 8th day he is to take 2 male lambs without defect, and a yearling ewe lamb without defect, and 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil for a grain offering, and 1 log of oil. And the priest who pronounces him clean shall present the man to be cleansed and the aforesaid before the Lord, at the doorway of the tent of meeting." This particular commandment applied to the Israelites living in the promised land. Since the temple does not exist anymore, this particular commandment is in abeyance. The burnt offering and the sin offering were given by God to the children of Israel as tools to teach unbelievers about personal sin and the need for atonement, as we saw in Galatians chapter 5, verse 3 and Galatians chapter 3, verse 24. We know from Romans chapter 3, verse 28 that Christians are justified by faith apart from the works of the law. But God gave these particular commandments to the children of Israel so that they could act as ministers, teaching the world about personal sin and the need for atonement. Commandment 176, Priests shall judge cases of rot in homes. Leviticus chapter 14, verse 33 says, "The Lord further spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, When you enter the land of Canaan, which I give you for a possession, and I put a mark of leprosy on a house in the land of your possession, then the one who owns the house shall come and tell the priest, saying, Something like a mark of leprosy has become visible to me in the house." This particular commandment applies to the priests who are the sons of Aaron, and it was part of the religious law that determined whether a person could enter the sanctuary or not. Since the sanctuary does not exist today, this particular commandment is in abeyance. However, as we see in Ezekiel chapter 44, verse 23, the role of the priests within the community of Israel was to teach the people the difference between what is holy and what is profane, what is clean and what is unclean. These laws were based on the principle of quarantine and good hygiene, which limited the community's exposure to potentially infectious diseases. Today we know, for example, that toxic black mold in a house is very dangerous and requires careful remediation. Once again, we see the wisdom of the great Creator God of the universe in giving to the ancient Israelites commandments that were light years ahead of their time. The Israelites didn't know about viruses and bacteria, and yet here God is giving the Israelites, through His Torah commandments, laws that would have promoted good health and long life. Commandment 177, Regulations for Male Uncleanness. In Leviticus chapter 15, verse 1, the Lord also spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel, and say to them, When any man has a discharge from his body, his discharge is unclean." This is part of a general law that it would have applied to Israelites and resident aliens alike. It would have caused the man to be segregated from the community for their protection. Once again, we see principles of quarantine and good hygiene in the Torah that limited the community's exposure to potentially infectious diseases. Commandment 178, Purification Offering for Male Uncleanness. Leviticus chapter 15, verse 14 says, "Then on the 8th day he shall take for himself 2 turtle doves, or 2 young pigeons, and come before the Lord to the doorway of the tent of meeting, and give them to the priest. And the priest shall offer them, one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. So the priest shall make atonement on his behalf before the Lord because of his discharge." This particular commandment applied to the Israelites living in the land of Israel. It was part of the religious law that governed who could enter the sanctuary and who could not. Once a man recovered from an infection that resulted in a chronic discharge, he was to present himself before the Lord at the sanctuary and make these offerings. The burnt offering and the sin offering are rituals that are designed to teach unbelievers about personal sin and the need for atonement. This was a particular ministry that God laid on the children of Israel alone. Commandment 179, Regulations for Seminal Discharges. Leviticus chapter 15 verse 16 says, "Now if a man has a seminal emission, he shall bathe all his body in water and be unclean until evening. As for any garment or any leather on which there is seminal emission, it shall be washed with water and be unclean until evening. If a man lies with a woman so that there is a seminal emission, they shall both bathe in water and be unclean until evening." Based on 2 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 17, this commandment applies to all believers. This law regulates proper hygiene and marital relations. Commandment number 180, Regulations for Regular Menstruation. Leviticus chapter 15 verse 19 says, "When a woman has a discharge, if her discharge in her body is blood, she shall continue in her menstrual impurity for 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening." Leviticus chapter 15 verses 19 through 24 give the complete list of regulations for regular menstruation that the Israelites were to follow. Based on 2 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 17, this commandment applies to all believers. These laws regulate proper hygiene and marital relations. But we must remember the original context within which these laws were given. When the ancient Israelites came out of Egypt and were traveling through the wilderness, they were living at a very primitive level of existence. The Bronze Age Israelites lacked modern sanitary products and indoor plumbing that mitigate the need for many of these regulations today. So, we need to use wisdom in how we apply these commands today, since our circumstances are different. Commandment 181, Regulations for Irregular Menstruation. Leviticus chapter 15 verse 25 says, "Now if a woman has a discharge of her blood many days, not at the period of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond that period, all the days of her impure discharge she shall continue as though in her menstrual impurity she is unclean." Leviticus chapter 15 verses 25 through 30 give the complete list of regulations for irregular menstruation. Based on 2 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 17, this commandment applies to all believers, and they regulated proper hygiene and marital relations. However, we need to remember that conditions today are not like they were in ancient Israel. Bronze Age Israelites lacked modern sanitary products and access to indoor plumbing that mitigate the need for these regulations. Today, doctors are able to quickly and effectively treat many of the problems that cause irregular menstruation. So we need to understand the original context for these laws, why they were given, and how they would apply today in a modern setting. Commandment 182, Purification Offering for Irregular Menstruation. Leviticus chapter 15 verse 28 says, "When she becomes clean from her discharge, she shall count off for herself 7 days, and afterward she shall be clean. Then on the 8th day she shall take for herself 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, and bring them in to the priest, to the doorway of the tent of meeting. The priest shall offer the one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. So the priest shall make atonement on her behalf before the Lord because of her impure discharge." This particular ritual is part of the religious law that was given specifically to the children of Israel living in the Promised Land while the temple was in existence. Since the temple no longer stands today, this particular ritual is in abeyance. We know from Scripture that the burnt offering and the sin offering are tools that God uses to teach unbelievers about personal sin and the need for atonement. As Galatians chapter 3 verse 24 makes clear, the law is a tutor to lead us to Christ so that we may be justified by faith. As Paul also made clear in Romans chapter 3, verse 28, Christians are justified by faith apart from the works of the law. However, God gave to the children of Israel these rituals in order to teach the unbelievers of the world about sin and their need for personal atonement.